Cheated mom, disowning dad, I was the stain of the marriage. Kicked out for being the stain on the family, I thought I'd lost everything, but that was the first step toward finding real love, justice, and a family who finally chose to stand by me. Welcome to Storytime Reddit, everyone. My name is Kane. I'm 17 years old, and the story I'm about to tell is probably the most painful chapter of my life, but also the beginning of reclaiming myself. Everything started falling apart last year when my mom, after nearly 2 years of having an affair with her high school ex, decided to run away with him. She disappeared for almost 2 weeks, then suddenly came back with a stack of divorce papers in her hand. No explanation, no tears, no apology, just a cold nod, as if I were nothing more than an old item she'd forgotten in a drawer. I thought that after everything, maybe my dad and I could rebuild something, even just a few words between us. But no, to him I was nothing but a shadow, a living reminder of a failed marriage. I used to think he hated me, but that wasn't it. The truth is, he despised me. Every look, every sigh he directed at me was loaded with resentment. As if I had been the one who betrayed him, not my mother. After she left, things only got worse. Dad no longer tried to pretend. He became distant, cold, barely spoke to me unless absolutely necessary. Mealtimes were nothing but silence, sometimes the clinking of silverware or a faint, contemptuous sigh. No one asked if I was okay, or hungry, or in pain. I existed in that house like an unpaid tenant, just temporarily allowed to stay until the owner decided to kick me out. I'd always known I'd have to take care of myself after turning 18. My dad made it clear he wouldn't spend a dime on my college, my housing, or anything else. But what I didn't expect was that he'd kick me out before I even turned 18. Just 2 weeks after marrying his new wife, the woman who used to be his secretary, they called me into the living room and told me that from now on, there was no room for me in the house. "We want a fresh start," my dad said, his voice completely void of emotion. "We don't want the past hanging around in this house anymore." I was that past. I told them I wasn't old enough to sign a lease, that college hadn't even started yet, that I didn't have a job or any savings because they'd always forbidden me to work, to protect the family image. I begged for some time, just a few months, to prepare, to figure things out, but all I got in return was a cold shrug from my dad and a contemptuous glance from my new stepmother. "That's not our problem," he said. "At your age, you should be able to take care of yourself." I screamed, I cried, I broke down right there in the living room for the first time in years. But they just got up, left me sitting there in pieces, and went on with their dinner like I never existed. I used to be afraid, terrified even, but that fear slowly turned into rage. That night, I packed a few clothes, some notebooks, and quietly left that house, the place that used to be called home. I went straight to my grandparents' house, the ones I had assumed were just like my dad. Traditional, obsessed with appearances, emotionally distant. But I was wrong. I didn't know what to expect when I knocked on my grandparents' door that night. A scolding, a disappointed look, or worse, rejection. But contrary to all the fear spinning in my head, the person who opened the door was my grandfather, his eyes filled with surprise, but not anger. As soon as I said, "I don't have anywhere else to go," he silently stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. My grandmother rushed out from the kitchen, her glasses slipping down her nose in a hurry. "Goodness, why do you look so pale? Have you eaten yet?" Her first question wasn't, "What happened?" It was, "Have you eaten?" And that broke me. After years of swallowing my pain in silence, I burst into tears like a child. My tears soaked her hands as she pulled me into the kind of warm embrace I had never known throughout my childhood. We sat in the living room until late into the night. I told them everything, how my mom had left, how my dad saw me as nothing more than a stain on his life. The story I'd kept buried in my chest exploded the moment I let it out. I saw the shadow darken in my grandfather's eyes with every word I spoke, while my grandmother just kept gently holding my hand, like she was trying to make up for years of missing affection. "If only we had known earlier," my grandfather said, his voice raspy, "things never would have gotten this far." I lowered my head, my voice trembling. "I thought you were just like Dad, only cared about appearances. I didn't think you'd care how I was really living." He placed a firm but gentle hand on my shoulder. "Your father learned his harshness from someone, and I won't deny that. But the difference is, we know when something's wrong, and we choose to make it right." That night, they let me sleep in the guest room. The next morning, my grandfather called someone to help bring my belongings from my dad's house, and he personally went with 2 assistants. I wasn't allowed to come. He told me to rest, that this was my home now. I didn't know until later that he had gone straight to my father's house and demanded to collect all of my things, no arguments. My father didn't say a word. Maybe it was the first time in his life that Grandpa no longer saw him as an heir, but as a man who had failed as a father. I didn't know what my grandparents planned to do next, but I never expected the answer to come so quickly. Just a few days later, Grandpa told me he had fired my dad from the family company. It was a huge shock. My father had always been the one being groomed to take over when Grandpa retired. But Grandpa revoked it all and didn't hide the reason. He told everyone in a company meeting, loud and clear, "I can't hand over the family legacy to a man who can't even care for his own son." When I heard what he said, I couldn't believe it. I had spent years living in silence, terrified of my dad, terrified of being punished, terrified of tarnishing Grandpa's name. And now, the very man I thought would protect his son at all costs was standing up for me. My dad was furious. He threatened to sue Grandpa for wrongful termination. But Grandpa just chuckled softly and said, "Go ahead. I'm not short on lawyers." And Grandma added, "If he had taken responsibility for his own son, maybe he wouldn't be cut off by him now." That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bedroom, staring at the ceiling. And yet, I felt more at peace than I'd ever felt in any place I'd lived before. I wasn't being ignored. I didn't have to tiptoe around the house like I needed permission just to breathe. I was being heard, understood, and for the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to belong to a family. I thought that once everything had settled, once my grandparents took me in, protected me, and showed me love, my dad would just accept the outcome. But I was naive. He didn't go quiet. In fact, he started messaging me more and more often. At first, it was just guilt-tripping lines like, "I don't deserve to be treated like this." But then the messages became full-blown accusations, calling me a traitor, an ungrateful brat, and a disrespectful son. At first, I didn't respond. And honestly, for the first few days, I stuck to that. But when the messages turned into veiled threats, things like, "You really think Grandpa will protect you forever?" Or, "Sooner or later, you'll have to live off your own money, and when that happens, don't come crying to me," I started to feel uneasy. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I realized he wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. He had lost control. Then came the old tactics emails, fake social media accounts, even late-night calls to my grandparents' landline. I had never seen a nearly 50-year-old man behave like a child who just had his favorite toy taken away. Every time I saw his name pop up on my phone, my chest tightened, not from longing, but from exhaustion. I was tired of being dragged back into a childhood filled with silence, fear, and isolation. So finally, I did what I should have done from the start. I blocked him. Every phone number, every email, every account, all of it gone. And for the first time in my life, I slept through the night without dreaming about him. But he didn't stop. When he realized he couldn't reach me directly, he turned his attention to my grandparents. He started calling their house, leaving cryptic messages, then spreading rumors among relatives that I'd made everything up just to get spoiled, that I set him up, and was trying to ruin the family's name. I didn't plan on responding, but my grandparents had other ideas. One evening, after a nearly 20-minute phone call with my dad, Grandpa walked into my room holding a small box. He said, "Read these. These are all the messages he sent this week. I think it's time we hand them over to the lawyer." I froze. "A lawyer?" "Yes," he replied. "If he dares mess with you again, we're going to file back." I couldn't speak. Not because I was scared, but because, for the first time, I truly felt like someone was standing up for me. Not for reputation, not for pride, but because they genuinely loved me. Not long after, my grandparents told me the company had started the process of reclaiming the house. My father was living in the same house owned by Grandpa's company. Grandma even planned to buy it herself and transfer the title to me. I was stunned. That house had once symbolized all the pressure and pain I'd endured. Now it might become something I owned? My dad lost it when he found out. His next message, of course, from yet another new account, wasn't a threat this time. It was a plea. "Don't take everything from me," he wrote. "You already took my job, my reputation, now my home. How much more do you want to destroy me?" I read it without feeling a thing, because the truth was, I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. I simply told the truth. And if that truth cost him everything, then that's not on me, that's on the way he treated me for 17 years. My grandparents call it justice. I just see it as balance. After all the years I spent living in the dark, the light finally found me not to seek revenge, but to help me heal. I thought that after my grandparents had personally handled the situation, reclaimed the house, and completely cut off contact with my dad, the storm would finally pass. But I was too optimistic. My father didn't stop. Instead of targeting me directly, he played his final card, suing my grandfather for unlawful termination. I heard the news from my grandparents one evening after dinner. My grandfather sat there silently, holding a letter from my dad's lawyer. "He really wants to take me to court," he said. Face unreadable, but I knew he was deeply disappointed. I felt guilty, even though I knew, logically, that I hadn't done anything wrong. A heavy weight still settled in my chest. I was the reason my grandfather, the man who had opened his arms to save me now, had to face his own son in court. I told him, "If this is happening because of me, I'll step back. I'll even go to court and say I made it all up." He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. His voice was low but firm. "Number, you're not a burden. You're the reason I'm doing the right thing. If we stay silent now, you'll have to live your whole life in your father's shadow." I nearly cried. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. My entire childhood, I'd been labeled the problem, the reason my parents fought, the burden no one wanted to carry. But that day, for the first time, I felt worthy of protection. The very next day, Grandpa called in the company's legal team, the ones he jokingly called the sharks in suits. They gathered all the evidence, texts, emails, even audio recordings of my father being irresponsible at work. Every time I saw those files, I felt conflicted. Not because I pitied my dad, but because I was watching the complete downfall of someone who had once been the only role model I had, however flawed and damaging that role had been. Less than 2 weeks later, my dad showed up, not with a lawyer, no paperwork, none of his usual arrogance. Just a worn-out man, eyes sunken, voice shaky, knocking on my grandparents' door. I was the one who answered. He looked at me, said nothing, no apology. He just walked past me into the house and waited for my grandparents. When they came in, he immediately spoke up, saying he wanted to settle things out of court. That he'd been emotional, that everything was a misunderstanding. He added, "We're family, there's no need to drag each other into court." Grandpa sat across from him, listened in silence, and then said just one sentence. "You chose this path, now you see it through." Then he turned to me and gently said, "Go on upstairs. I'll handle the rest." I nodded and followed his instructions without protest. But just as I reached the stairs, my dad suddenly pointed at me and growled, "If there's anyone to blame for this, it's him. He's the one who ruined this family." I froze, not out of hurt, but out of pity. A man nearing 50, whose career had collapsed, whose wife had left him, who lost custody, lost his job, his house, and still couldn't take a hard look at himself. I didn't respond. I just quietly walked up the stairs. Behind me, I heard Grandpa's voice, calm but firm. "He didn't ruin anything. You destroyed it all by yourself." My dad left that day. No one walked him out. No one asked him to stay. He walked away from a family he once had the chance to preserve, but lost through nothing but pride and selfishness. I didn't feel triumphant. I wasn't happy. I just felt relief, because finally, I wasn't just a shadow in my father's eyes. I was a person with a voice, with choices, and most importantly, with a new family who listened, understood, and loved me for who I truly am. After my father came to my grandparents' house and was firmly rejected by Grandpa, when he tried to settle things out of court, I thought he would quietly disappear from my life. But I was wrong. He didn't let go. Just a few days later, I started receiving a flood of messages from old numbers, unknown numbers, even emails. All of them were filled with blame, guilt-tripping, and emotionally manipulative lines. "You're truly heartless," he wrote. "I just wanted to start over, and you're out here trying to ruin my life." I stayed silent. I had learned that not every message deserves a reply, but the more I stayed silent, the more he pushed. Sometimes he would change his tone. "I miss you. No matter what, I'm still your dad, right?" But then, just a few messages later, he'd revert to the same old refrain. "Everything I lost is because of you. You betrayed the family." I knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't care about me. He never had. What he truly mourned wasn't the loss of his son, it was the loss of status, of assets, of the things that once let him walk around with his head held high. Things got worse when Grandma told me he was about to be evicted from the company-owned house we had lived in for years. My grandparents had already started the process to buy the house and planned to transfer ownership to me. When I heard that, I was stunned. I asked, "Why me? Isn't this a bit too much? Grandma simply placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes firm yet kind. Because you deserve it. And because we want you to know even if your father turned his back on you, someone will always stand by your side. I couldn't hide my emotions. Part of me felt a sense of justice not because I was inheriting the house, but because it felt like truth was finally being acknowledged. But another part of me felt sadness. No matter how much hurt he caused, he was still my father. Deep down, I had hoped he might change. That hope died completely when I received one final message from him this time. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was long, full of self-pity. He said he had lost everything, that I would never understand what it felt like to be betrayed by your own child. That because of me, he'd lost his inheritance, the house, the company, everything. At the end, he wrote, "I hope you're happy seeing me with nothing. You took it all." I held my phone, read it again and again, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear or confusion. I just felt relieved. Because at last he admitted the truth, that I was now the one inheriting what he once believed was rightfully his. And that made him angry not because I didn't deserve it, but because I dared to rise. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My silence was the clearest answer I could give. I'm not the one who destroyed him. He did that to himself. I only told the truth. And if the truth cost him everything, that's not my fault. It's the result of how he treated me for 17 years. My grandparents called it justice. I just saw it as balance. After so many years living in the shadows, the light had finally reached me, not for revenge, but for healing. Living with my grandparents, I began to understand what it really meant to be loved. Meals were no longer tense silences. "How are you doing today?" was no longer a polite formality. It was a real question, and they truly listened. Even though my heart still carried scars from a childhood of neglect, from a father who never cared, at least now, I had begun the journey toward healing. I was no longer that child treated like shadow. I was myself, and I was learning how to stand tall on my own 2 feet. After everything, all the texts, the blame, and the guilt my father tried to place on me, I reached a point where I was just exhausted. Deep down, I just wanted to cut ties completely. At first, I hesitated. I still felt that tiny pull of blood ties, that lingering idea of family. But then I realized blood is never an excuse for a father to treat his son like the shadow of his own failure. So I started blocking every account he used to contact me. Phone, email, social media, all of it, locked out. I didn't want to know where he was, how he was living, or if he was busy spinning some new pity story. I was done. Living with my grandparents truly marked a turning point. At first, I was nervous, afraid they, too, only cared about appearances like my father did. But no. While they were firm about routines, eating on time, keeping things tidy, being respectful, they also cared deeply about my emotions, and that caught me off guard. One night at dinner, while I was eating quietly, my grandmother put down her chopsticks, looked at me, and asked, "Are you feeling any better?" I looked up, and for the first time in years, I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to say, "I'm still tired," but I also wanted to say, "Maybe just a little." In the end, I just nodded and said softly, "I'm trying." She smiled and said something I'll never forget. "No one expects you to be okay right away, but at least now you can be tired in a safe home." I almost cried right then because for the first time I felt seen. I wasn't just a quiet shadow at the dinner table. I wasn't just a backdrop for my father's image of a perfect family. I was a person allowed to hurt, to be sad, to simply exist. During that time, my grandparents helped me remake all my documents, finalize my college enrollment, and even contacted the bank to begin transferring the assets they planned to leave for me. At first, I didn't want to accept it. I told them, "I can manage on my own. I don't want to disrupt everything because of me." But Grandpa looked serious for the first time since I'd lived with them. He spoke with a firmness that still carried so much love. "You're not taking anything. You're simply receiving what should have been yours a long time ago. No one has the right to take that from you, not even your father." And so, they began the process. The house my father used to live in, the company property owned by Grandpa, was bought out by Grandma and would be transferred to me when I turned 18. My college tuition was fully paid, but more importantly, I finally lived in a home where my voice mattered. Of course, it wasn't over yet. My father still tried to drag me into the legal battle with Grandpa, but this time, he didn't resort to texts. Instead, he started using my name during court hearings, shifting the blame onto me. He claimed the ungrateful son made it all up, that I just wanted to seize the family assets, and that my grandparents had manipulated me into turning against him. I didn't show up. I left it to Grandpa and the lawyers. But when I heard my father say in court, if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have lost everything, I just smirked. He still didn't get it. I wasn't the reason he lost everything. He did that to himself, piece by piece, with the way he treated me for all those years. And now, as I stood in this house full of light where meals weren't stage performances, I understood something. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness to the truth. And even though the road ahead might still be hard, at least now, I no longer walk it alone. About a week after things had started to calm down, I got word that my dad had officially filed a lawsuit against my grandfather claiming wrongful termination. I wasn't surprised. With his blind pride, getting fired wasn't just about losing income, it was about losing face. It was a direct slap to the image he had spent years carefully building. But what worried me was whether this would cause any trouble for my grandparents. Even though Grandpa had assured me he was fully prepared, I didn't want the people who had opened their arms and saved me to suffer the consequences of someone who used to be my father. So I took the initiative and handed over every message my father had ever sent me, the ones filled with blame, manipulation, and even the ones where he accused me of destroying the family. Grandpa's lawyers were incredibly professional. They said the messages would strengthen the case for legitimate grounds of dismissal, proof of his mental instability, and a clear pattern of deflecting responsibility instead of owning up to his actions. I still remember that afternoon clearly sitting beside my grandmother, handing her my phone as she quietly read through each message. When she was done, she sat silently for a few seconds, then let out a long sigh. "If he dared to treat you like that," she said, eyes distant, "then he's not just a failure as a father, he's a disgrace to this family." The days that followed, I tried my best to focus on preparing for college. Even though the legal battle was still unfolding, I chose not to be involved directly. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had lived it, and the truth had already been exposed. But of course, life doesn't stay quiet when someone like my father is still clawing for control. He began spreading rumors among distant relatives, saying that Grandpa had been brainwashed by me, that I was chasing money, trying to steal everything that was rightfully his. I heard about it from a distant uncle who sent me a short message. "Don't let gossip affect you. The ones who matter already know the truth." I smiled reading that. I didn't feel hurt anymore, just mildly amused. The same man who once called me a burden was now terrified of losing things he never truly deserved in the first place. The truth is, he didn't have many supporters left. After Grandpa publicly stated the real reasons for firing him, that he was unfit to manage, frequently mismanaged company records, and made reckless decisions that cost the business, most of the extended family went quiet. Maybe they'd suspected for a while but had never dared say it out loud. My father's lawsuit hadn't been settled yet, but he had started to back down. One day, he even showed up at my grandparents' house to negotiate. I was the one who opened the door. He stared straight at me and said nothing. I didn't say anything either, just turned and let Grandpa and Grandma deal with it. Later, they told me he had asked to settle out of court, claiming he'd been acting out of momentary anger. Grandpa coldly responded, "If you knew you were wrong, you wouldn't have dragged my grandson into your dirty game." He refused to negotiate. Before leaving, my father turned toward me. I was standing at the end of the hallway and shouted, "You know this is all your fault." I didn't flinch. I just stood there, looking him straight in the eye, calmer than I had ever been, because I understood this was the clearest sign of a man falling apart. A man who had once believed he held all the power. And me? The person he once called a burden, a stain on the family name? I was standing there, not for revenge, but as a witness to the truth. Sometimes, simply living your truth draws the clearest line between what's right and what's not clearer than any argument could ever do. And finally, that day arrived. I packed my bags, folded my clothes carefully, and gathered everything I'd need for this new chapter college. It wasn't just a change in location. It was a transformation, the beginning of a life I never thought I'd have. For the past few months, I had been living with my grandparents, the only people who had ever shown me real, unconditional care. I had gone from being the boy abandoned by his parents to someone who now had a roof over his head, financial support, and most importantly, the belief that he was worthy of love. During that time, my father vanished from my life completely. No messages, no calls, not even a hint of regret. After losing everything, the house, the job, his reputation, he simply disappeared. And to be honest, I didn't care to know how he was doing. What I did learn, however, was something important. Sometimes, to survive, you have to let go of people, even if they're family. The night before I left, my grandmother arranged a small farewell dinner. just a few close relatives, the ones who stood beside me when everything fell apart. During that dinner, my grandfather stood up, raised his glass, and looked straight at me. Then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. You've lived in silence for too long, but ever since you spoke up, you not only saved yourself, you helped this entire family see what needed to change. I'm not just proud you're my grandson. I'm grateful. Because it takes courage to break a toxic cycle. For a moment, the table was silent. Then my grandmother reached out, gently rested her hand on my shoulder, and smiled. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, seen, acknowledged, and valued. The next morning, I left for school. My college wasn't far, but for me, it felt like crossing into a brand new universe. My dorm room wasn't large, but it was mine. My bed, my schedule, my space, and a freedom I'd never tasted before. Above my desk, I pinned a photo of the three of us from that dinner. When I look at it, I see everything I've overcome. I am no longer the frightened boy hiding in the shadow of a cold father. I'm someone stronger, braver, and finally free. If you've ever been made to feel like your existence was a burden, hear me now. You deserve love, and walking away from pain isn't weakness. It's the first step to healing. I lost a family. But I found myself.